Nolan Ashford never imagined the day he lost his job would begin with a word of thanks. 10 years of loyalty ended in a glass conference room under cold autumn light, while rain streaked the windows of Aurelius Dynamics like tears no one in that building was willing to shed. Vivian Hawthorne signed the termination order without hesitation, her pen steady, her face unreadable. There was no argument, no defense offered, only silence and the soft click of a pen cap against polished wood. Nolan simply smiled, picked up a small cardboard box holding 10 years of his life, and walked toward the woman who had just erased his career. Before the door closed behind him, he leaned close and said 4 words that would haunt her for the rest of the year. Don't trust your own family. 3 days later, over $1 billion vanished from the company's accounts, and Vivienne would discover that the only person who had ever tried to save her was the man she had just thrown away. Nolan Ashford was not the kind of man who raised his voice. He had spent 6 years as a military internal auditor before joining Aurelius Dynamics. And in that world, numbers did not lie. Even when people did. He carried that discipline into every ledger he touched, every signature he verified, every wire transfer he traced back to its origin. His desk was always clean. His reports were always precise. He believed a company, like a soldier, survived only through discipline and truth, and he had built his entire career on that belief. Quietly, without asking for recognition. Colleagues respected him, though few truly understood him. He rarely joined the after-work gatherings, rarely laughed at the jokes traded in the executive lounge, and never once asked for a favor from anyone above him. He raised a young daughter alone, and though he almost never spoke of her at the office, those who knew him well understood that everything about his discipline, his patience, his refusal to cut corners, came from the simple fact that someone at home depended on him to be exactly the man he claimed to be. He was, by every account, the most reliable person in the building, and the most invisible. It began with a discrepancy so small that most auditors would have dismissed it without a second glance. A payment routed through a subsidiary in Singapore, cleared in under 4 minutes. Approved by a signature that did not quite match its usual pattern. A hairline difference most eyes would never catch. Nolan pulled the file. Then he pulled 3 more. Within a week, he had uncovered a pattern of altered records stretching back 14 months. Invoices padded by tens of thousands of dollars, digital signatures duplicated with unsettling precision. Every thread led toward the same office on the top floor, the office belonging to Graham Whitmore, chief financial officer, and uncle to the woman who ran the company. Nolan did not celebrate the discovery, did not rush to share it with colleagues eager for gossip. He simply wrote it down, methodically, the way he had been trained to, cross-referencing every figure twice before committing it to paper, and prepared a report meant for no one but the highest levels of oversight. He submitted the report through the proper channel, sealed and confidential, expecting a quiet investigation to follow, the kind of careful process he had seen work a dozen times before. Instead, within hours, the file had been forwarded directly to Vivian Hawthorne's desk. Stripped of its context, framed by someone else's commentary, someone who had clearly read it before she ever saw it. By the time Nolan was called into the boardroom, the story had already been rewritten without his knowledge. Vivienne sat at the head of the table, flanked by 6 senior executives, her expression carved from stone. She did not ask him to explain his findings. She asked him why he had chosen to attack her family. Nolan answered plainly, the way he always did, laying out dates, transaction numbers, and inconsistencies that any trained eye could verify within the hour. No one at that table wanted to verify anything. The room turned against him with unsettling speed, the way a current turns without warning beneath still water. One executive suggested the discrepancies were nothing more than clerical errors, exaggerated by a man with a grudge against leadership he had never truly respected. Another implied that Nolan had been passed over for promotion years earlier and sought revenge through fabricated claims dressed up as diligence. Vivienne listened to all of it, her jaw tightening, her eyes fixed on the man who had served the company faithfully for a decade without a single complaint against his name. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat and final, the voice of someone who had already decided before the meeting began. You are terminated, effective immediately. No one in that room objected. No one met his eyes. Nolan gathered his folder, closed it slowly, and rose from his chair without a single word of protest, because he had learned long ago that truth rarely wins an argument in a room built on loyalty to power rather than loyalty to fact. He walked past the long table, past the executives who had once shaken his hand at company events, past the assistant who had brought him coffee every morning for 3 years, and now would not lift her eyes from her tablet, past the glass wall overlooking the city he had helped protect from ruin twice before, though no one in that room remembered it now. At the door, he paused, turned, and looked directly at Vivienne, unhurried, unafraid. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, entirely without malice, the voice of a man delivering a warning rather than an accusation. "Don't trust your own family," he said, and then he left, the door sealing shut behind him with a sound like a verdict handed down in an empty courtroom. Vivienne stood there a long moment, the words settling somewhere she would not admit they had landed, before she straightened her jacket and returned to the meeting, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, as if a decade of a man's work could be dismissed in the space of a single signature. Vivienne Hawthorne did not sleep well that night, though she told herself repeatedly that it meant nothing. She told herself it was the merger, the pressure of finalizing the largest deal in company history, the endless calls from investors demanding certainty in an uncertain quarter. She told herself Nolan Ashford was simply a man unable to accept his own failures, lashing out at the family that had built the empire he worked inside for a decade. She repeated this to herself until it sounded almost true, until the words felt worn smooth from repetition. And then she poured herself a glass of water and stared out at the rain-soaked skyline, refusing to acknowledge the small, persistent unease coiling somewhere beneath her ribs. Graham Whitmore, meanwhile, was not sleeping either, though for entirely different reasons. In the hours after Nolan's dismissal, he sat alone in his office. The city lights reflected in his glasses, and made a single phone call, brief, unhurried, the call of a man who had rehearsed this moment long before it arrived. By morning, an internal technician named Derek Colby had submitted his resignation without notice, citing a family emergency that no one bothered to question in the chaos of the merger. Server logs from the finance division, spanning the previous 18 months, were quietly purged from the backup archive within hours, erased with the kind of surgical precision that only someone deeply familiar with the system could manage. Graham moved with the calm confidence of a man who had done this before, erasing footprints as easily as Nolan had once uncovered them, believing entirely in his own invulnerability. Miles Donovan noticed first. As director of internal security, and one of the few people in the building who had ever called Nolan a friend rather than merely a colleague, Miles reviewed the surveillance logs out of habit more than suspicion. What he found stopped him cold. The security cameras covering the finance archive had gone dark for exactly 37 minutes on the night of Nolan's termination, the footage replaced by a looping error message that any competent technician could fabricate in under an hour, if given the right access. Miles said nothing to Vivienne. Not yet. He understood, better than most, that accusations inside Aurelius Dynamics required proof, not instinct. And instinct alone had already cost one good man his career and his reputation in a single afternoon. That same night, a hard drive disappeared from the finance department's secure storage room, a room accessible only by keycard, a room whose access log would later show, impossibly, that no one had entered at all. Whoever had taken it understood the system well enough to erase their own presence from it entirely, leaving behind nothing but an absence where evidence should have been. Vivienne remained unaware of any of this. She spent the evening reviewing merger documents at her kitchen table, confident that the storm of the day was behind her, confident that loyalty within her own family was the one certainty she could still rely on in a company built on shifting numbers and hungry competitors circling from every direction. Just past midnight, an email arrived in her private inbox, sent from an account with no name attached, no signature, no trace of origin that her assistant could later identify no matter how many technicians examined it. The subject line was empty. The body contained a single sentence, stark against the white of the screen, glowing faintly in the dark of her apartment. The man you fired is the only honest person left in this building. Vivienne read it twice, then a third time, her hand hovering over the delete key before finally, slowly, pulling it back. She sat with the sentence for nearly an hour, turning it over the way she might turn over a stone to see what lived beneath it, and did not sleep again that night. Guilt, Vivienne would later admit, was not an emotion she allowed herself often. She had built her entire leadership around certainty, around never appearing to second-guess a decision once it was made public. But something about the silence with which Nolan Ashford had accepted his termination gnawed at her in a way she could not dismiss, a silence too calm to belong to a man who had truly been lying. 3 days after his dismissal, and alone in her office long after the building had emptied of everyone but the cleaning staff, she opened his personnel file and began reading, not out of duty, but out of a need to prove to herself that she had made the right decision, that the unease in her chest was misplaced. What she found instead began to unravel everything she believed about the man she had fired. 10 years of records showed a pattern so consistent it bordered on stubbornness. Nolan had declined every improper bonus offered to him over the years, flagged 3 separate instances where he could have profited quietly, and chose instead to report them to compliance, and had personally uncovered fraud that saved the company from 2 catastrophic lawsuits, one in the early years of his employment, another just 18 months prior, a case Vivienne remembered vaguely as having been resolved without incident. Never realizing the man behind that resolution had walked out her front door 3 days earlier. He had never once taken credit publicly for either discovery. There was no ambition in his file, no history of conflict, no pattern of the vindictive behavior his colleagues had accused him of in that boardroom. There was only a decade of quiet, unglamorous integrity, and page after page of a man doing his job correctly, while the people around him quietly did not. She called Miles Donovan into her office near midnight, unable to wait until morning, unable to sit with what she had found in silence any longer. He arrived, still in his coat, sensing from her tone that something had shifted beneath the surface of the company he had sworn to protect. She showed him the personnel file, the pattern of refusals, the lawsuits Nolan had quietly prevented without ever asking for recognition. Miles listened without interrupting, his expression darkening with each page, then said the words that would echo in her mind for days afterward. If Nolan said there was fraud, then there was fraud. That man doesn't lie, Vivienne. He doesn't know how. Vivienne sat with that sentence long after Miles left, turning it over like a stone in her palm, feeling its weight settle against everything she had believed about her own family. The suspicion, once planted, spread quickly, the way rot spreads through wood that looks solid on the surface. Vivienne began pulling financial records herself, quietly, without informing the board, without alerting anyone in the finance division who might report back to her uncle before she had answers of her own. She cross-referenced vendor payments against shipping manifests late into the night, searched for the Singapore subsidiary Nolan had flagged in his original report, and found, buried 3 layers beneath a shell entity registered in a jurisdiction she had never heard of, an offshore account whose beneficiary meant nothing to her at first glance. It took another hour of digging, another hour of her heart pounding harder with every clicked link, before she recognized the name listed at the very bottom of the account structure. Graham Whitmore. She stared at the screen for a long time, the office silent around her, the city outside blurred by rain against the glass. The same rain that had fallen the day she fired. The one man who tried to warn her. 10 years of trust collapsed in the span of a single scrolled page. She thought of every family dinner where Graham had praised her leadership, every board meeting where he had defended her decisions against skeptical investors twice her age, every quiet moment where he had called her the daughter he never had, holding her hand at her father's funeral, and promising he would always look after her. None of it matched the numbers glowing on her screen. She closed the laptop slowly, her hands trembling in a way they never trembled in front of the board, and understood, for the first time, that the man who had raised her after her father's death might also be the one destroying everything her father had built. Vivienne did not go to the board. She did not go to security, not fully, not yet. She told no one that she had traced the offshore account back to her own family, terrified of what it would mean to say it aloud. Instead, she began working alone, late at night, cross-checking every transaction Graham had authorized over the past 2 years, building a private record of her own, terrified that a single misstep would alert him before she had enough to act with any real authority. She told herself she was protecting the company. In truth, buried somewhere beneath the careful language she used even in her own thoughts, she was protecting a fragment of hope that there might still be an explanation, some innocent accounting error, some misunderstanding, anything that would let her keep believing in the man who had raised her. Graham Whitmore was not a careless man, and he had not survived 3 decades at the top of a defense contractor by missing the small signs that mattered most. Within days, he noticed the quiet pattern of Vivienne's late-night logins, the files she had accessed, the searches that traced too closely to accounts he had spent years concealing behind layers of shell corporations and quiet arrangements. He said nothing to her directly, gave no indication at family gatherings that anything had changed. Instead, he made calls of his own, reaching contacts who understood how to erase a digital trail cleanly and permanently, the kind of people whose names never appeared on any invoice. A hacker was hired under an alias that would never be traced back to him, tasked with wiping the remaining evidence from every server the company owned, including backups stored off-site for precisely this kind of emergency. Miles Donovan felt the shift before he fully understood its cause, the way a soldier feels a change in the air before the first shot is fired. His own credentials were quietly flagged, his badge access restricted to lower floors under the justification of a routine security audit that had never actually been requested by anyone in his chain of command. His personal phone began receiving calls from unknown numbers, silent on the other end, disconnecting the moment he answered, always at strange hours. Always brief enough to avoid a trace. He recognized the pattern immediately, having spent years training others to notice exactly this kind of quiet intimidation. Someone was watching him, testing how much he knew, deciding whether he was a threat worth eliminating before this went any further than a few flagged files. Nolan Ashford, meanwhile, had vanished almost entirely. His apartment sat dark for 4 consecutive nights, curtains drawn, mail collecting untouched at the door. His phone, when Miles tried to reach him, rang unanswered before disconnecting entirely, the line going dead in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Former colleagues who tried to check on him found no trace, no forwarding address, no explanation left behind for anyone curious enough to ask. It was as though the man had simply stepped outside the boundaries of the story he had once been part of, choosing invisibility over confrontation, patience over panic, exactly the way he had operated for 10 quiet years inside a company that never fully understood what it had in him. Then, on a gray Thursday morning, a small unmarked package arrived at Vivienne's private residence, delivered by a courier who could not later be identified through any tracking system, as though he too had understood the value of leaving nothing behind. Inside, wrapped in plain brown paper with no name, no return address, no indication of where it had originated, was a single unlabeled flash drive. Vivienne held it in her palm for a long moment before carrying it to her private laptop, disconnected entirely from every company network, and inserting it with hands that had not stopped trembling since the night she found the offshore account bearing her uncle's name. The files loaded slowly, revealing themselves in fragments across the screen. Transaction histories stretching back 3 years, cross-referenced against shell companies registered in 4 different countries she would later need a map to locate. Audio recordings, time-stamped and labeled with a precision that could only belong to someone trained in forensic documentation, someone who had spent a career learning exactly how evidence needed to look to survive scrutiny in a courtroom. Internal emails, some of them she recognized from her own inbox, others she had never seen before, exchanges between Graham and men, whose names meant nothing to her, but whose intentions became unmistakable the longer she read. Every thread, every payment, every whispered conversation captured on those recordings led back to the same man. The man who had taught her to ride a bicycle. The man who had called her the daughter he never had. Vivienne understood immediately what she was looking at, and the understanding arrived like a physical blow. Nolan had not stumbled onto fraud by accident. He had been building this case for months, perhaps longer. Quietly gathering proof, while continuing to perform his duties without complaint, waiting for the moment the evidence would be undeniable enough to survive the very boardroom that had turned against him. He had been terminated before he could finish, before he could take it to the authorities through proper channels, before anyone in power would believe a single word he said against a man they trusted completely. And yet, somehow, even after being discarded, humiliated, walked out in front of colleagues who had shaken his hand for years, he had found a way to make sure the truth reached her regardless. But she also understood, with a sinking clarity that settled cold in her stomach, that what she held was not yet enough. Compelling, yes. Damning, certainly, to anyone willing to look closely. But not sufficient to survive the legal scrutiny a case against her own family's chief financial officer would inevitably demand from every direction at once. She made a decision that night that she would later describe as the first honest choice of her entire career. She would find Nolan Ashford herself, not through company channels, not through official inquiries that might alert Graham to how close the truth had come to reaching daylight, but quietly, personally, the way a person seeks out someone they have wronged and hopes for a chance, however small, to make it right. She told no one of her plan, not even Miles, understanding now that trust had become the rarest currency inside the walls of Aurelius Dynamics, a currency she had spent recklessly and now needed to earn back one careful decision at a time. 2 nights later, a traffic camera near the Federal District captured a grainy image that would later become critical to everything that followed. Nolan Ashford, dressed plainly, unremarkable in every visible way, walking into a nondescript building at 9 in the evening, meeting briefly with a man later identified as a federal investigator specializing in corporate fraud and international wire schemes. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Neither man carried a bag, exchanged a folder, or lingered outside afterward, moving with the quiet efficiency of 2 professionals who understood exactly how much time they could safely spend together. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing at all. To anyone who understood what was coming, it looked like the opening move of an inevitable collapse that had been building for months beneath a surface no one else had thought to examine. Vivienne finally found him on a Tuesday evening, in a small diner on the edge of the city, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that never quite cooled, the kind of place no one from the office would ever think to look. She sat across from him without an invitation, without calling ahead, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them heavier than any words either could offer. Nolan studied her the way he studied ledgers, patiently, without judgment, waiting for the numbers to reveal themselves on their own, rather than forcing a conclusion before he had all the facts. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked in a way it never did in boardrooms, a rawness she had never once allowed anyone at the office to witness. "I found the account," she said. "I found what he did." Nolan nodded slowly, unsurprised, as though he had been waiting for this exact conversation since the moment he walked out of that glass office 3 weeks earlier, with nothing but a cardboard box and a warning. She asked him to come back, offering everything she thought might convince him, his position restored, his reputation cleared publicly, any resources he needed. He refused, calmly, without bitterness. The way he refused everything that strayed from what he believed mattered most. "I'm not trying to save the company," he said. "I never was. I just didn't want thousands of employees to lose everything because one man decided the rules didn't apply to him." Vivienne absorbed the words in silence, feeling the full weight of what she had done to him settle across her shoulders like something physical. For the first time in her career, she said the words aloud, plainly, without qualification, without the careful language she used to soften every difficult admission. "I was wrong. I should have listened. I let my own blindness protect a man who never deserved my trust in the first place." Nolan did not offer forgiveness immediately, but he did not walk away either. And for a man like him, that silence was its own kind of answer. More honest than any apology could have been. They talked for nearly 2 hours that night, the diner emptying around them slowly, coffee going cold in cups neither of them touched, the waitress refilling water glasses out of habit rather than necessity. Nolan laid out everything he had gathered, the evidence still missing. The legal thresholds that needed to be met before an arrest could hold under the weight of a defense team Graham could easily afford. Vivienne listened with the focus of someone finally willing to hear the truth, instead of managing it for public consumption, asking questions instead of offering excuses, taking notes on a napkin because she had left her phone behind. Afraid of being tracked. By the time they left, an agreement had formed between them, unspoken in its fullness, but understood completely by both. They would work together, quietly, methodically, until Graham Whitmore could be caught with evidence too complete to dismiss, too public to bury, too final for even his considerable resources to survive. Vivienne confronted her uncle 3 days later, in his office, with the door closed and the city stretching gray and rain-soaked beyond the window behind him, the same view he had stood in front of for 30 years while building the empire her father had started. She placed a folder on his desk, thinner than the evidence Nolan had gathered, deliberately incomplete, but enough to make her intentions unmistakable to a man who understood numbers better than anyone she knew. Graham studied the documents without alarm, turning each page slowly, then looked up at her with an expression she had never seen him wear before, something colder than she remembered from any moment of her childhood, something that had perhaps always been there beneath the warmth she had mistaken for love her entire life. He laughed, quietly, almost fondly, as though she were still the child he had taught to ride a bicycle decades earlier in the driveway of a house that no longer belonged to either of them. "Family is the only thing worth trusting in this world, Vivienne," he said, his voice steady, unbothered by the folder between them, as though it contained nothing more than a minor accounting discrepancy. "Everyone else will abandon you the moment it benefits them to do so. That employee you fired, he'll disappear the moment this becomes inconvenient for him too." Vivienne did not flinch, though everything in her wanted to. "Family doesn't stand above the truth," she answered, her voice steadier than she felt, and something in it made it clear this was no longer the niece he remembered, the girl who once believed every word he told her, but a woman who had finally stopped mistaking loyalty for love. The confrontation spread quickly through the upper floors of Aurelius Dynamics, whispered between assistants who claimed to have overheard raised voices, debated behind closed doors by board members, forced to choose a side before they fully understood what either side represented. Some believed Vivienne had lost her composure under the pressure of the merger, that grief and stress had finally caught up with a young executive carrying too much weight alone. Others, quieter, more observant, began recalling small inconsistencies in Graham's reports over the years that they had never dared question aloud, afraid of what questioning a man so powerful might cost them personally. The board split cleanly down the middle, half rallying behind the family name that had built the company from nothing, half waiting silently to see which side would produce undeniable proof before committing to either direction. Graham understood, better than anyone in that building, that time was no longer working in his favor. That same night, he activated a plan he had prepared months earlier, a contingency built for exactly this kind of exposure, the kind of plan a careful man keeps ready, even when he believes he will never need it. Instructions went out to 3 separate financial institutions before midnight, authorizing the transfer of the company's remaining liquid reserves into accounts scattered across jurisdictions that would take years to unwind through international courts. In years, he was confident he would never have to spend answering for. He believed, with the confidence of a man who had outmaneuvered every obstacle in his path for decades, that by morning the money would be gone, and with it, any real consequence for everything he had done. Nolan and Miles had anticipated exactly this move, having spent the previous week preparing for the possibility with the federal investigator Nolan had quietly met days earlier in that nondescript building near the courthouse. Working together, sharing information across a secure channel Miles had built specifically for this purpose. They had already flagged the accounts Graham was most likely to use, requesting real-time monitoring the moment any unusual activity appeared on any of them. When the first transfer request hit the system just after 11 that night, 3 separate alerts triggered simultaneously across 2 continents, waking analysts in 3 time zones at once. Nolan watched the numbers scroll across his screen with the same steady calm he had carried through every audit of his career, knowing that patience, more than anything else, was about to become the difference between justice finally arriving and a man disappearing forever into a system built to hide exactly this kind of theft. Graham sat in his office as the first transfer confirmed on his screen, a small, satisfied smile crossing his face, believing the hardest part was already behind him and the rest would simply take care of itself. He poured himself a drink, loosened his tie for the first time in weeks, and allowed himself a moment of genuine relief, the tension of the past month finally beginning to loosen its grip on his shoulders. He thought, briefly, of the girl he had taught to ride a bicycle, of the funeral where he had promised to protect her always, and told himself none of that had ever truly been a lie, that a man could love someone and still take what he believed the world owed him. That relief lasted less than 20 minutes. A call came through from his private banker, his voice tight with confusion and something close to fear, explaining that the accounts had been frozen without warning and flagged under a federal investigation Graham had no knowledge existed until that exact moment, an investigation that had apparently been building quietly for weeks without his ever noticing a single sign of it. He moved quickly after that, abandoning his office without gathering anything more than his coat, leaving behind a laptop still open on his desk, its screen glowing with unfinished transfer requests that would soon become critical evidence in a courtroom he had never imagined facing in his life. He drove through empty streets, slicked with rain, hands tight on the wheel, heading toward the private helicopter pad the company kept for executive travel, believing there was still time to disappear entirely, to become a name in a jurisdiction with no extradition treaty, to vanish the way he had once so easily erased evidence from a server that should have been protected. He never made it off the ground. Federal agents were waiting at the pad when his car arrived. Having tracked the frozen transfer requests back to his personal accounts within the hour, moving faster than he had ever believed possible for an institution he had spent years learning to outpace. Graham stepped out of his vehicle into blinding floodlights, his composure finally breaking for the first time in the entire ordeal, the calm confidence that had carried him through decades of quiet theft evaporating in an instant. There was no negotiation, no clever explanation prepared for this particular moment, nothing in 30 years of careful planning that had accounted for this exact scene. He was arrested standing beside the helicopter that was meant to carry him beyond consequence, the rain soaking through his suit as agents read him his rights beneath a sky, the color of wet concrete, the same rain that had followed this entire story from its very first day. The news reached Vivienne just after midnight. Delivered by Miles, in a voice still shaking with adrenaline he could not entirely suppress. She said nothing for a long moment, standing alone in her office, the city lights scattered like broken glass across the windows behind her. 10 years of trust, undone in a single night, collapsing into something she was not yet ready to fully feel. She thought of every dinner, every lie told with a smile across a table she had once believed was the safest place in the world. Every moment, she had mistaken control for care. Then she picked up her phone and called Nolan, her voice steady despite everything churning beneath it, and said only 3 words, "It's over now." The shareholder meeting 3 weeks later was unlike anything Aurelius Dynamics had ever held in its history. Vivienne stood before the full board, investors, and senior staff, and did something no executive in the company's history had done before her. She told the truth, completely, without spin, without the careful language typically reserved for crisis management and quarterly reassurance. She admitted her own failure to listen, her blindness toward her own family, her dismissal of a man who had tried to warn her when it still might have mattered, when a single different decision might have saved everyone months of quiet suffering. She turned to Nolan, seated quietly in the 3rd row exactly as he had once sat in countless meetings, unnoticed by most of the people around him, and spoke directly to him in front of everyone present. "I owe you an apology I can never fully repay," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "You tried to save this company when I refused to see the truth standing directly in front of me. Every person in this room owes you more than they will ever know." The applause that followed was slow at first, uncertain, then steady, then overwhelming, filling the room in a way that felt less like celebration and more like long overdue recognition, finally arriving for a man who had never once asked for it. She offered him the position of interim chief executive that same afternoon, a gesture meant to restore publicly what had been taken from him privately. Nolan declined, gently but firmly. The way he declined every offer that strayed from what he believed he was meant to do with his particular set of skills. "I'm not built for that chair," he told her, a faint smile crossing his face for the first time in weeks. "I'm built for finding what's hidden. Let me keep doing that instead." Vivienne did not argue with him. She had learned, finally, after everything they had both survived, that some people were most valuable precisely where they chose to stand, and that forcing them elsewhere only diminished what made them essential in the first place. The full evidence was released to shareholders and regulators alike in the weeks that followed. Every falsified signature, every offshore account, every quiet lie Graham Whitmore had told for years laid bare in careful, methodical detail that left no room for ambiguity or defense. Nolan's original report, once dismissed in a boardroom as baseless accusation from a bitter employee, became the foundation of the entire federal case against a man who had believed himself untouchable. His name, once erased from the company directory in a single afternoon without ceremony, was restored publicly, permanently, with an apology issued not in private, but in front of every employee who had once watched him carry a cardboard box out the front door in silence. A year passed, and Aurelius Dynamics emerged from the scandal stronger than it had ever entered it. Its reputation rebuilt not through denial or careful public relations but through radical, uncomfortable transparency. Vivienne restructured the entire executive framework from the ground up, dismantling the informal privileges that had once allowed family ties and personal loyalty to override basic accountability. Every transaction above a certain threshold now required independent verification from someone outside the immediate chain of approval. Every signature, digital or otherwise, was cross-checked by a system Nolan himself had helped design. One built on the same principles he had lived by for a decade. Quiet, thorough, and entirely incorruptible. Nolan Ashford became the company's first chief ethics and risk officer, a title created specifically for him, one that gave him authority across every division without tying him to the boardroom politics he had always despised and never learned to navigate. He worked much the same way he always had, methodical, unglamorous, largely unseen by anyone outside the rooms where numbers told their quiet truths to those patient enough to listen. But now, when he flagged a discrepancy, people listened immediately. Now, when he submitted a report, it reached the people who needed to see it, unaltered, unbroken by anyone standing between him and the truth he had spent his entire career protecting. On the evening, the company finalized the merger that had once seemed destined for collapse. Vivienne and Nolan stood together on the rooftop terrace of the headquarters, the city stretching gold and silver beneath a clearing sky. The rain that had followed them through every difficult month had finally broken that afternoon, leaving the air clean and cold and full of a possibility neither of them had felt in a very long time. Vivienne turned to him, a small smile, crossing her face for the first time in longer than she could remember without effort. "The day you left," she said, "you told me not to trust my own family." Nolan considered the words for a moment before answering, his voice as calm and steady as it had always been, even now, even here. "I only wanted you to trust the truth first," he said. "Everything else can follow from there, if you let it." Vivienne looked out over the illuminated city, the lights stretching endlessly toward a horizon neither of them could fully see from where they stood, and let out a breath she felt she had been holding for over a year without realizing it. "This time," she said quietly, "I know exactly who I should trust." Nolan did not answer with words. He simply stood beside her, steady as he had always been, watching the same skyline she watched, and for the first time in either of their lives, silence between two people felt less like distance and more like the beginning of something. Neither of them was in any hurry to name, something patient and honest, built the same slow, careful way everything worth keeping had always been built between them. Somewhere below them, the city kept moving, indifferent to the two people standing quietly above it, and neither Vivienne nor Nolan felt any need to hurry toward whatever came next. They had already learned, in the hardest way possible, that the things worth having were rarely the ones that arrived quickly, and that trust, once broken and slowly rebuilt, was worth infinitely more than trust that had never been tested at all.